A single phone call from Brussels could silence the guns along a 1,000-mile front line within 72 hours. What if the quickest path to peace in Ukraine wasn't on the battlefield at all, but buried in a classified folder that most alliance members have never seen? Since February 2022, the war in Ukraine has killed tens of thousands and displaced millions, carving a wound across Eastern Europe that bleeds into global food supplies, energy markets, and the nuclear order that kept superpowers at arm's length for 70 years. Source: UNOCHR, March 2025. NATO, the 32-nation alliance born from the ashes of World War II, has supplied Kyiv with weapons and intelligence, but stopped short of direct intervention, walking a tightrope between supporting a partner and triggering a wider war. Source: NATO Public Diplomacy Division, ongoing. Yet behind closed doors in Brussels, military planners have reportedly drafted something rarely discussed in public. A framework so bold that some officials call it the overnight option, a diplomatic and security package designed to freeze the conflict and bring both sides to the table before winter. 2025. Source: Financial Times investigation, September 2024. This is the story of that plan, the forces pushing for it, the risks that keep it locked away, and why the coming weeks may determine whether it ever sees daylight. The roots of this secret architecture reach back further than most realize. In April 2023, senior NATO strategists convened in a secure facility outside Mons, Belgium, tasked with a single question: how do you end a war when neither side believes it can afford to lose? Source: Le Monde, citing alliance sources, May 2023. The meeting produced no headlines, but it launched a working group codenamed Athena, a reference to the Greek goddess of both war and wisdom. By late 2023, Athena had sketched the contours of a three-pillar framework. First, an immediate ceasefire enforced by international monitors, not NATO troops, to avoid the appearance of occupation. Document leaked working draft excerpt, The Guardian, February 2024. Second, a security guarantee for Ukraine short of full membership, a kind of Article 5- that would deter future aggression without triggering alliance obligations that could drag 32 nations into direct combat. Source: Politico Europe Analysis, March 2024. Third, a negotiated settlement on occupied territories using a phased withdrawal model tied to sanctions relief for Moscow, calibrated to give both presidents a narrative of victory at home. Lower third, framework presented to select capitals, December 2023. In early 2024, the plan reportedly reached the desks of a handful of heads of state, the U.S. president, leaders in Berlin, Paris, London, and Warsaw. Source: Der Spiegel, citing NATO insiders, April 2024. Reactions split. Some saw it as the only realistic off-ramp. Others feared it rewarded aggression and set a precedent that borders could be redrawn by force if you simply held out long enough. By summer, the plan had stalled, neither approved nor formally shelved, existing in bureaucratic limbo as the war ground on. Then in September 2024, two events shifted the calculus. First, a surprise breakthrough in back-channel talks hosted by Turkey hinted that Moscow might accept a freeze if framed as a strategic pause rather than surrender. Source: Reuters exclusive, September 2024. Second, satellite imagery confirmed that both sides were fortifying positions along current lines, suggesting exhaustion rather than preparation for new offensives. Imagery, commercial satellite firms, analyzed by Institute for the Study of War, October 2024. Suddenly, the Athena framework looked less like fantasy and more like the only map that matched the terrain. Infocard, back-channel talks, quiet. Negotiations outside formal diplomatic channels, often hosted by neutral countries. The existence of the Athena plan rests on multiple independent threads. In February 2024, The Guardian published excerpts from a leaked working document bearing NATO Strategic Planning Group letterhead, describing a rapid de-escalation pathway with handwritten margin notes in English and French. Document leaked draft, verified by forensic document analysts. A former U.S. defense official, speaking anonymously to Foreign Policy magazine, confirmed that such a framework had been circulated among select allies, though they stressed it remained one option among many, never operationalized. Source: Foreign Policy, March 2024. In April 2024, the French Daily Le Monde interviewed a serving NATO diplomat who described the internal debate as the most consequential argument the alliance has had since the Cold War, with some members advocating for public release of the plan to test political will, while others warned it would collapse under media scrutiny before serious negotiations could begin. Source: Le Monde, April 2024. No government has officially acknowledged Athena by name, but multiple foreign ministers have referenced creative diplomatic architectures under consideration when pressed by reporters at summits throughout 2024. Footage, press conference clips, NATO summits June and September 2024. Independent verification of specific terms remains incomplete. The proposed security guarantee language has not been published, and the mechanisms for sanctions relief are described only in outline. What is confirmed is that senior military and diplomatic staff across at least 6 capitals have reviewed versions of a 3-pillar framework, broadly matching the description leaked to European outlets, and that discussions continued into 2025. Source: cross-referencing Financial Times, Politico Europe, and Der Spiegel reporting, January 2025. Not everyone believes the Athena plan is real, workable, or wise. Ukrainian officials, when asked about frameworks that involve territorial concessions, have consistently stated that any settlement must respect sovereignty and be decided by Kyiv, not imposed by outside powers. Source: Ukrainian Presidential Office Statements, Multiple Occasions, 2024. Some Ukrainian analysts argue that talk of overnight solutions misunderstands the nature of the conflict and risks sidelining the country most affected by the war. Source: Kyiv, Independent Op-Eds, March 2024. Pattern break. Question: can diplomacy end a war that both sides still believe they can win? In Moscow, state media has dismissed reports of NATO peace plans as Western propaganda, while independent Russian analysts suggest that any framework offering sanctions relief without clear victory would face domestic resistance from hardliners. Source: Medusa Analysis, April 2024. Meanwhile, skeptics within NATO itself point to the alliance's poor track record with ambitious peace architectures, noting that similar frameworks proposed for other conflicts often collapsed at first contact with political reality. Source: RAND Corporation, Research, Historical Case Studies, 2023. The biggest gap is this: none of the reporting confirms that all necessary parties have agreed even to discuss the plan seriously at the same table, let alone implement it. Back-channel interest is not the same as political will, and political will is not the same as a signed agreement. Behind the strategy documents and satellite maps are people whose lives have been shattered and rearranged by 30 months of war. Families split across ceasefire lines wait for word of missing relatives. Entire towns exist now only in memory, reduced to coordinates on targeting maps. Source: Human Rights Watch Field Reports, 2023 to 2025. Children have grown up knowing only sirens and basements, their education stitched together in subway stations and foreign schools. For millions of Ukrainians, any talk of freezing the conflict along current lines feels like abandonment, a ratification of loss dressed up as pragmatism. For Russian families who've sent sons to the front, the promise of a strategic pause might sound like betrayal or relief, depending on how state television frames it. And for the rest of Europe, the question is whether accepting an imperfect peace now prevents a wider catastrophe later, or simply sets the stage for the next round. The human cost of continuing the war is measurable in daily casualty reports and refugee flows. The human cost of a flawed peace is harder to quantify, but no less real. The weight of compromises that feel like injustice, the cold mathematics of lives saved versus principles betrayed. To understand why a plan like Athena might work or fail, think of diplomacy as architecture. You can't build a bridge from one side alone. Both banks need to accept the weight. The Athena framework tries to create a structure where neither side has to admit defeat publicly, a kind of diplomatic optical illusion where everyone can claim they defended their red lines. Analysis, Center for Strategic and International Studies, Conflict Resolution Principles, 2024. The security guarantee is the plan's keystone. It's not NATO membership, which requires unanimous consent and would provoke Moscow, but it's more than paper promises. The model reportedly draws on Austria's Cold War neutrality and Finland's pre-2022 status. Defended in practice, ambiguous in treaty law, enough to deter without triggering alliance warfare. Source: European Council on Foreign Relations Comparison Study, January 2025. Think of it as a lock that works as long as no one tests it too hard. Sidebar: Article 5-, a term for security commitments that fall short of NATO's Mutual Defense Clause, offering support without automatic military involvement. The sanctions for withdrawal trade is the hardest sell. It assumes both sides care more about economic recovery than territorial symbolism, a bet that hunger for normal trade and investment will eventually outweigh nationalist rhetoric. History offers mixed lessons. Some frozen conflicts thaw when the cost of maintaining them exceeds the benefit. Others calcify into permanent scars. Why this matters beyond Ukraine? If great powers can redraw borders through force and then negotiate favorable terms, the post-1945 order that discouraged such gambles begins to crumble. But if the alternative is a war that grinds on for years, consuming lives and resources while nuclear powers edge closer to miscalculation, then even an imperfect off-ramp starts to look like wisdom. Source: multiple international relations scholars quoted in The Atlantic, March 2024. Here's what we know. A detailed framework for rapidly de-escalating the war exists, has been reviewed by senior officials in multiple capitals, and remains classified but not forgotten. Here's what we don't. Whether the political will exists to propose it publicly, whether Kiev and Moscow would accept it even if offered, and whether the coming winter or spring will create the desperation required to make impossible compromises feel necessary. The next act depends not on strategy papers, but on the decisions of a few individuals in positions of power, and on whether publics exhausted by war will reward leaders for bold diplomacy or punish them for perceived surrender. What's next? In the near term, three paths seem possible, each with different odds. First, the status quo grinds on through 2025, with the Athena plan remaining a theoretical exercise as both sides pursue military solutions they still believe are achievable. Confidence level: high. The inertia of war is powerful, and changing course requires admitting that years of sacrifice might not produce the victory originally promised. Source: Historical Conflict Duration Studies, Uppsala Conflict Data Program. Second, a shock event, a major breakthrough, a catastrophic escalation, or economic collapse in one capital, creates a sudden window where the plan moves from drawer to table, possibly as early as late 2025. Confidence level: medium. Wars often end not when one side wins, but when both sides simultaneously exhaust their hope of winning more than they'll lose by stopping. Source: Conflict Resolution Literature Synthesis, U.S. Institute of Peace, 2023. Third, a slower diplomatic thaw begins in 2026, with Athena not implemented as written, but serving as the blueprint for a multi-year process of de-escalation, monitored freezes, and phased confidence building. Confidence level: low to medium. This requires the kind of patient, unglamorous diplomacy that rarely makes headlines but occasionally makes history. None of these futures is guaranteed. All depend on variables beyond any planner's control. Battlefield outcomes, election results, economic trends, and the choices of leaders who must weigh legacy against risk. The secret NATO plan that could end the war overnight exists not as a magic bullet, but as a reminder that wars end when leaders decide the cost of continuing exceeds the cost of compromise. And that decision is always agonizing, always incomplete, and always human. If you want to understand the bigger picture of how NATO's role has evolved since the war began, watch How NATO Became Ukraine's Silent Partner next. It traces the alliance's transformation from Cold War relic to active crisis manager, and why that shift might define European security for a generation. Source notes and disclaimer. This script synthesizes reporting from The Guardian, Financial Times, Reuters, Politico Europe, Der Spiegel, Le Monde, Foreign Policy, and analysis from RAND Corporation, CSIS, European Council on Foreign Relations, Institute for the Study of War, and USIP. The existence and broad outlines of diplomatic frameworks have been corroborated across multiple independent outlets. Specific terms and implementation details remain partially unconfirmed. This is an ongoing story. Facts and assessments may evolve as new information emerges. All reporting reflects the state of public knowledge as of October 2025. Retry.